I recently did a couple of mini-series on Bob Dylan and Neil Young over the decades, their studio recorded output over the decades. And that was a lot of fun. And it got me thinking, how many artists started in the 60s and are still active today? Well, there aren't a lot, but there are some. And it got me thinking about one particular artist, and that would be Paul McCartney. Now, because Paul's been active for quite a long time, I know that many people first experience Paul McCartney and come in to learn about Paul McCartney at different points in his career. Now, for me, I go all the way back for the Beatles. Some people are first exposed when he was with Wings, and some people have been exposed to him much later in his career. Over the series of these episodes, we'll try to cover all of that. Paul McCartney has recorded an incredible amount of music. So this is going to be a career-spanning miniseries, and as I was putting this together, I kept finding more recordings that Paul has done. So I don't know if I've got a complete set here. There's probably some that I've missed, but it'll give you a really good idea of how prolific Paul McCartney is. I'll look at his studio albums, I'll look at his live albums, and I'll look at compilation albums as well. So we'll start at the beginning, when Paul is part of the Beatles. Now, there is so much material to cover that I think I will do it like the famous Red and Blue albums. This first episode will be 1963 through 1966. And then the second episode coming will be 67 on to 69. Then future episodes will continue into the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and all the way up to today. So let's go back in time to 1963, to England, and let's take a look at the life and music of Paul McCartney. Let's drop the needle. The 1960s was certainly the decade of the Beatles. They had honed their skills by playing 8 hours a night gigs in Hamburg, Germany. Then when they returned to Liverpool, they played in the afternoons, lunchtimes at the Cavern, and then at night in gymnasiums and halls. To say they were head and shoulders above the other acts at that time is an understatement. Their manager, Brian Epstein, went to London to secure a recording career for the Beatles, but he found it a hard sell. But he finally did secure a contract with Parlophone, a part of the massive EMI record label. I'm going to be focusing on the English Beatle albums and the songs that Paul sings lead on or co-sings with one of the other members of the band. Now, I am not diminishing the talents in any way of John Lennon, of George Harrison, of Ringo Starr. After all, it took the four of them to make the incredible Beatles. So let's start with the first album that they released in 1963 under their contract with Parlophone, and it's called Please Please Me. The album contains 14 songs, a mixture of songs that were cover songs and then some that are actually written by Lennon and McCartney. Now, the interesting thing is that the entire album was recorded in one day. Paul has 3 lead vocals on this album. 2 are original songs he wrote with John, I Saw Her Standing There and P.S. I Love You. And then there is the old standard, A Taste of Honey. Then Paul also shares vocals with John on Misery, Please Please Me, Love Me Do, and There's a Place. The album was a huge hit in the UK. It went into the top 10, and it stayed in the top 10 for over a year. Now, this was a record for a debut album to do this, and that record has lasted for over 50 years. Interestingly enough, in the US, these Beatles songs are going to be released on Capitol Records, but Capitol decides to pass on this album. So this album was not at the time released in the US. What Capitol did is when they started to release Beatles records, they took songs from this album and sprinkled them through subsequent albums. Their producer, George Martin, and manager Brian Epstein decided the Beatles should release 2 albums and 4 singles each year. And all this is in addition to touring, first in England and then the world. Talk about a grueling schedule. On November 22nd, 1963, the day before President Kennedy was assassinated, the Beatles released their second album, and it is called With the Beatles. On this record, Paul sings lead on 3 songs, 2 co-written with John, All My Lovin' and Hold Me Tight. And then there's one old show tune, Till There Was You. And he also then shares vocals with John on the original Little Child. Like the first album, this album was also a huge hit in England. It went to #1. And in fact, it displaced Please Please Me in the #1 spot. Please Please Me had climbed up to there. And when you look at the two albums together, they occupied the #1 spot in the charts in the UK for almost a year. In the US, Capitol decides, yeah, I guess we'll release this album. And they call it Meet the Beatles. And it is the first US Beatles album released by Capitol. But it's not the same as the UK. And then on February 9th of 1964, the Beatles appear on The Ed Sullivan Show. And like so many kids in the US, I was glued to my television set. And my life changed dramatically, as did many other kids. I wanted to be a Beatle. And the Beatles had that effect on lots and lots of teenagers. In 1964, the Beatles get signed to create a feature film. And of course, there has to be a soundtrack to go along with that. And naturally, that soundtrack is called A Hard Day's Night. Now, as always, I'm going to be looking at the English release because the US release of A Hard Day's Night is a little bit different. This is the first Beatles album that has no cover songs on it. They are all originals. Paul sings lead on 3 songs. They were all written with John. They are And I Love Her, Can't Buy Me Love, and one of my favorites, Things We Said Today. Then he shares lead vocals with John on A Hard Day's Night and If I Fell. And again, it's a #1 album, this time in the UK and the US. In December 1964, the Beatles record their 4th album, Beatles For Sale. Once again, Paul has 3 lead vocals, I'll Follow the Sun and What You're Doin', both co-written with John, and then a cover of Little Richard's, the great Kansas City, Hey, 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 Hey. And with John, he sings Babies in Black, 8 Days a Week, Every Little Thing, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, and he and John sing with George on Words of Love. Once again, in the UK, this goes to #1 on the charts, but this album was not released in the US until 1987. What Capitol did is take some of these songs and put them on a record called Beatles 65, which was only released in the US. And now it is 1965, and it's time for the Beatles to make yet another movie. And of course, this one's going to be in color, and it's called Help. And yeah, there has to be a soundtrack for that, and that album is also called Help. Paul sings 5 songs from the film The Night Before and Another Girl. And he also sings Tell Me What You See, my favorite, I've Just Seen a Face, and the most covered song of all times, Yesterday. Naturally, the album goes to #1 in the UK, but in the US, it's a totally different record. Side 1 has the songs from the film, but on side 2, it's just instrumental music from the film. As part of their 1965 US tour in August, the Beatles played Shea Stadium in front of 55,600 fans, their largest concert by far. The Beatles arrived by helicopter for the concert. The concert was filmed for a TV release in the UK and the US. But because of all the screaming, the audio on many of the songs had to be re-recorded back in London studio for placement in the film. The film, or at least parts of it, can be found on YouTube. Then in December of 1965, the Beatles kind of shake things up. They start to move in a new musical direction, and the album they release is called Rubber Soul. As usual, Paul sings lead on 3 songs, You Won't See Me, Michelle, and I'm Looking Through You. Then he joins John singing Drive My Car and Wait. Now we're halfway through the 60s, and the Beatles decide to put out an album that again stretches what's possible. The album is called Revolver, and even the cover is unique. Paul sings lead on 5 of the 14 songs, Eleanor Rigby, Here, There, and Everywhere, Good Day Sunshine, For No One, and Got to Get You Into My Life. And then in August of 1966, the Beatles perform their last paid concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. They have decided to stop touring and concentrate on making music in the studio. With the release of Revolver, Paul, with the Beatles, had released 7 albums since 1963. And I said at the beginning that we'd be mirroring in this episode the time frame for the Red Album, which is 63 through 66. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. In the next episode, we'll look at Paul McCartney's contributions to the Beatles recordings in 1967 through 1969. Lots of music and a lot more coming as we look at each decade of Paul McCartney's great talent. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for watching. Keep it rocking.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.